Good afternoon, buenas tardes, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual afternoon with Dan Glickman to discuss Laughing at Myself, My Education in Congress, on the Farm, and at the Movies, published by the University Press of Kansas. Dan Glickman is a former vice president of the Aspen Institute, a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and a board member of the World Food Program USA. He served for 18 years in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing the 4th Congressional District of Kansas as the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture from 1995 to 2001, and as chairman of the Motion Picture Association of America from 2004 to 2010. To moderate this afternoon's conversation, we're joined by Congressman Charlie Dent. Congressman Dent is the executive director and vice president of the Aspen Institute Congressional Program, where he leads bipartisan, bicameral policy education programs for sitting members of Congress. Congressman Dent also serves as a senior policy advisor to DLA Piper, where he provides strategic advice and counsel to clients on a variety of public policy issues. In addition to his roles with the Aspen Institute and DLL Piper, Congressman Dent is a political commentator for CNN, a distinguished advisor for Pew Charitable Trust, and a former visiting fellow for the University of Pennsylvania, Perry World House. Throughout this afternoon's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of Laughing at Myself from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Welcome.
Thank you. Welcome. Great to be with you. And thank you. So I'm taking it up from here. I'm Charlie Dent, former member of Congress. And most importantly, I am the man who succeeded Dan Glickman at the Aspen Institute Congressional Program. Nobody can replace Dan, but I simply succeeded him. So happy to do so. And I'm delighted to be moderating this conversation today with Dan about his book, Laughing at Myself, My Education in Congress, on the Farm, and at the Movies. And so we have a lot to talk about. I've known Dan for many years, and so there's so many places to begin. I thought I'd start right at the beginning. Let's bring Kansas and Pennsylvania together. Harry Specter and Jake Glickman were in the scrap business together. Now, most people say, well, who are those guys? Well, Harry Specter was the father of the late Pennsylvania Senator Arlen Specter, and of course, Jake Glickman being Dan's father, and they were in the scrap business together in Kansas. And I just thought that it was always such an interesting story. And so, Dan, I wanted to at least let you tell us about, what was it like growing up in Kansas in the 1950s?
Well, first of all, it was my grandfather, Jake. But I knew Arlen very well, and he lived in Russell, Kansas most of his life, and was a very good friend. But my grandparents immigrated from Eastern Europe, like so many other people did. Ended up in Wichita. My grandfather used to say that he was one of the first settlers in Kansas. He settled for 10 cents on the dollar. That was the joke. So humor was very much a part of our family. They settled in Wichita, a town of about 300,000 people, known for a lot of things, not only agriculture, but known as the air capital of the world, because it's the home of Beech, home of Cessna, home of Learjet, and the Boeing company build a lot of airplanes there. So when I was in Congress, we had upwards of almost 50,000 aircraft workers in Wichita. So had a great family and supportive, and decided to go into politics as a kid.
Well, interesting. Now, I thought I just kind of follow up on that aircraft theme for a second. Of course, those who are in the general aviation business were always subjected to lawsuits, and I suspect that puts you in the crosshairs with some of your Democratic colleagues who tended to be more aligned with the trial lawyers, and I know that there were some real, very serious liability issues that those manufacturers were facing, and I suspect that puts you in a difficult spot at times.
Well, there was this problem that every time a small airplane would go down, the liability would be enormous for the manufacturer, even if the manufacturer weren't liable. So I, along with others, worked on legislation that provided a way to limit that liability for very old airplanes. And it's curious that right afterwards we passed that bill, and then the Cessna Aircraft Company reopened their single engine assembly line. And
Yeah.
I thought I was the greatest hero in the world. Unfortunately, I lost my next election, but I still did a good thing for my district.
Yeah, that was very important because it was an issue where I lived in Pennsylvania too. There was a Piper jets or Piper planes up in northern Pennsylvania. Same issue, but I didn't realize you were the man behind that. I also want to just kind of just pivot to, you were at the University of Michigan, I guess, at the time of the Vietnam War. How did that impact you at the university? And by the way, I think you met Rhoda there as well.
Yeah, my wife and I met. She was from Detroit. I'm from Wichita. We've been married almost 55 years, a long time, have 2 children around the age of 50 years old. So very lucky, and 4 grandchildren. So, but I went to Michigan during the heavy Vietnam era. Tom Hayden, you may recall that he was married to Jane Fonda. He did the Port Huron Declaration at the University of Michigan. There were 3 schools in the country that were really hotbeds of activism: Michigan, Berkeley, and Columbia. And so I wasn't too active in politics, but being in Michigan during the war, and particularly when the draft began to claim a lot of people, my year did get me much more engaged in being against the Vietnam War.
Sure. Well, I thought I'd also just kind of pivot a little bit too to back to Kansas for a second. Growing up in Kansas, you mentioned that you're in the book. You mentioned that throughout my life, especially in high school and college, I always found being Jewish as largely positive and helpful to me in many ways. Can you tell us why that was, and particularly in Kansas? I'm from Eastern Pennsylvania. We have a substantial Jewish community and a vibrant Jewish community, but in Kansas, you don't think so much about a Jewish community out there. And but tell us about that.
Well, and of course, we're in South Florida, where there's a very, very large and substantial Jewish community. But a lot of Jewish immigrants went to small towns. They became either in the retail business or scrap iron business. When I say a lot, you would find Jewish settlers in a lot of these communities like Wichita, Oklahoma City, Tulsa, Des Moines, Omaha. And so so being Jewish, there were probably 5 Jewish kids in my high school. There certainly weren't very many Jewish people in farming at that time, but I found it to be a positive. First of all, a lot of people had never met anybody Jewish before. I found people to be very tolerant, and I remember one woman coming up to me and she says, "Well, I don't care what religion you are, just as long as you take care of my Medicare problem." And as you know, as a former congressman, people care much more about their issues, their problems, than they are about your ethnic background.
Absolutely. Absolutely. They just want you to perform. Tell us a little bit too about, your parents and, how they influenced you and what memories you might have there. And I'm sure, like all proud parents, they get involved with your campaigns. And as I used to say to my mother, God may she rest in peace, I used to often say to her, Mom, you're there to help me. You're not there to run the campaign. Okay. This is not, we want your input, but we don't want your 2 cents worth. Okay.
Well, I got my father did give me his 2 cents worth, both literally and figuratively, which helped. But both of my parents had this terrific sense of humor. My dad was the Rodney Dangerfield, Henny Youngman. At times, he would tell all sorts of jokes. They're in the book. Most of them are politically correct, by the way. I shouldn't have any problem on YouTube down the line. And my mother had this very natural sense of humor. I remember I took her to the White House. The first George H.W. Bush had a congressional picnic, and you've been to these picnics before. And I introduced my mother to President Bush, and President says, "Well, we sure do love your son, Mrs. Glickman. We just wish he would convert." And of course, he meant from Democrat to Republican. My mother, without missing a beat, says, "Oh, Mr. President, we like being Jewish." And every time I saw President Bush, because he used to come down to the house gym to play racquetball, he would say to me, has your mother forgiven me yet? And I said, she loves you, Mr. President.
Yeah, by the way, we play paddleball in the members gym. I should let you know that.
Okay.
Paddleball. And it was a one-wall paddleball. And we have legendary battles down there. It was a great time. I thought I'd just also pivot a little bit too. Your start in politics, I noticed you were on the school board out there in the Wichita Public School Board. And I often thought that going on the school board was like a political dead ender for most people, that you get on the school board, you're probably going to raise some property taxes, and there you go. There goes the political career. And I was just curious, how you felt about your time on that school board, and how did that affect you in terms of your ambitions to become a congressman?
Well, we were actually in better times. We had some real serious issues involving busing in Wichita. Ironically, the head of the department in the federal department involved in the Wichita busing case was one Leon Panetta, who became Secretary of Defense, head of the CIA, and White House Chief of Staff. And he was involved in a lot of the busing issues involving Wichita. But I was there during quieter times. We had a big school bond issue. We built a lot of schools. And so it also the congressional district was about 80% composed of the school district. We had about 55,000 students in the school district. So to be perfectly honest with you, it made it convenient when I was campaigning for Congress that I had been a school board member and president about the contemporaneous area of the congressional district.
Well, and before you got to the school board, I know when you first went to Washington, I know you worked for a Republican congressman from Colorado. Can you tell us about those years? What was your impression of that congressman, and what?
Actually, it was his name was Peter Dominic, and he was a senator from Colorado.
Excuse me.
And I worked for him, and he was a good guy. I was a flunky. I was the guy who took his car out and got gas, and when the days when you could do that, probably. I remember when after Martin Luther King was assassinated, Washington was blowing up, and he asked me to take his car out for gas, and I drove out, and it took me about an hour and a half to get around the building because the entire town was a war zone. And I came back, and his gas tank was totally empty. And he's basically said, "Is that all you could do?" I said, "Senator, that was all I could do without getting killed." And but I worked for him. It was a good start. And I met a guy named Brian Lamb who worked in his office. And Brian Lamb later founded C-SPAN, which a lot of people watched. And he was Senator Dominic's press secretary and has been a friend for life.
Well, that's a great story. Now, when you worked in that senator's office too, I suspect you were probably doing things like the mailroom, or opening the mail back then when we did such things. Not that I don't think many, they don't do much of that anymore now. Everything's electronic, digital, email. Was that what you were doing? And what did they pay you too back then?
I think I got $4.65 an hour, $4.65 an hour.
Yeah.
But I opened the mail, and I also used the auto pen, which is, back in those days, you'd stick a pen into a machine, and it would actually look like the senator had signed his or her own letters. And I would run the paper through. I'd do about 400 or 500 a day. And by the way, when I got to Congress, we were still getting mail. This is before a lot of the digital technology. And I'd come in on Saturday morning and open all my own mail. We might get 200-300 letters. And I would not be very careful about where the envelopes went. And so my staff would go nuts because they couldn't find the envelope that had the return address for the letter that came in. But I found that reading that mail right when it came in was impactful for me because I could really feel what the person was asking about.
Yeah, and a lot of constituents, of course, were never shy about expressing their opinions.
No,
very directly. Hey, what do you tell us too about one of your stories in the book? You talked about the most powerful man on earth. Why don't you elaborate that a little bit?
Yeah, I've embellished that story slightly, but when I was Secretary of Agriculture in 1997, they had something called the designated survivor. So this was when they thought, well, if the whole building gets blown up, there's got to be one person. And some people remember the TV show with Kiefer Sutherland. on the ABC show, The Designated Survivor. So they chose me. I don't think because of my great political skills, but they tended to choose the Secretary of Agriculture or the Secretary of Interior. I said they chose us because we were the most important cabinet departments, but that was, of course, my own joke. And so I went to my daughter's apartment in New York because they wanted me out of town. Bill Clinton, and I was accompanied by Secret Service and military people, and Bill Clinton was supposed to give a 40-minute speech, and he was prone to speak longer than he was required to. So he spoke for about an hour and 40 minutes. And after it was over, the Secret Service left, and I took my daughter to dinner that night with no security. And there was this giant blinding sleet storm. And we walked out of a restaurant about 12 blocks from her house, and there was no such thing as Uber or Lyft. This was 1997, nor were there cabs. And so we walked back to her apartment, frozen to death, basically. And I looked at her and I said, Amy, 3.5 hours ago, I was the potentially most powerful man on the face of the earth, and we can't even get a cab. And it's a great lesson in life. It's like the old Frank Sinatra song, that's life. 1 minute you're on top, but the next minute you're down at the bottom. And resiliency is the name of the game.
Yeah, I believe me, I understand. You're the most powerful man on earth, and then you're taking out the garbage.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
So
we have that at home too.
Yeah, I know. Well, good. By the way, just for our viewers and listeners, that designated survivor is usually designated, I guess, during for the State of the Union address, when everybody's together, and then you, the cabinet secretary, are asked to sit out at some remote location, I guess.
Well, it's a lot more secure now, Charlie, after 9/11 than it was before 9/11. And I even think they have a designated survivor for Congress now, as well as for the executive branch.
Yeah, I know. That's I'll tell you, that's quite a great story. Another thing too, I read about you too, that when you were Secretary of Agriculture, you talked about getting a lot of things thrown at you from time to time. Tell us about how that all played out. I guess food fights are not uncommon in American schools, but we usually don't think of the Secretary of Agriculture participating in such things. But tell us about that.
Well, it taught me that people do really care about food. So I was as far as I could tell, I was the most assaulted member of the cabinet. So I had a woman scream at me at a National Nutrition Summit, throw a tofu cream pie at me, and called me a pimp for the meat industry. And it grazed me on the shoulder, and it hit former Congresswoman Donna Shalala on the back. And Bob Dole was with us, and I turned to Dole and I said, hey, Bob, I don't think we're in Kansas any longer. And then I had a woman in Yellowstone Park, because the agriculture department was dealing with a disease called brucellosis that affected animals, and we were actually killing some of those animals to protect the cattle. And so she came up and threw infected buffalo guts at me and the two senators and the governor of Montana. And my mother was very upset because she thought I was going to have some sort of disease for the rest of my life because it was an infectious disease. And the final one, there were several of these, by the way, but the one that was most interesting at the World Food Summit in Rome, where I led the delegation, and the Pope spoke, and Fidel Castro and Bill Clinton, and we had a big news conference, and the entire front row of the news conference stood up, totally disrobed, naked, and on their bodies written, of course I didn't look, but I was told later on, was written the naked truth and no gene beans, like no GMOs, so to speak. Yeah. And so I thought to myself, this is a tough business. And my folks saw this on CNN, the network that you're involved with, later on. It was either the next day. And my mother called me and she says, I'm so upset. I told you shouldn't have taken this job. It's the most dangerous job in the world. Just a minute, your father wants to talk to you. And so my dad got on the phone. He says, tell me, what did it look like? So you could see the difference in the perspectives.
That's pretty funny, actually. That's my goodness. Speaking of Bob Dole, obviously a one-man institution out in Kansas all himself. You served in the Congress when Bob Dole was a senator, and when I guess Nancy Kassebaum, I think, was a senator back then too. What was it like? Obviously it's a very Republican state, Kansas, and I think you at some point were a Republican in your life. Then you changed to Democrat. Is that right, Dan? think you froze up, Dan. I think is Dan frozen or am I?
Yeah, it looks like he's frozen. So what I'm going to do is, if he doesn't come back in 1 minute, I think I'm just going to try to bring him back in.
Okay.
Close out his video. That could just be a problem with his internet.
Okay.
All right.
Do that.
Try it. No, he's not accessible to bring back in. So let's just wait until he finds his way back in.
Okay.
So sorry about that.
That's okay. Hey, that's what we deal with in the virtual world.
Indeed. Oh, everything was going too smoothly. Okay, so let me see. Maybe Johanna. Johanna, I think you're watching. If you can call Dan and see if we can get him back on, that would be great. To everyone else watching, thanks for your patience. Yeah, it still looks like he's off here. Okay, Johanna is calling him.
Okay.
By the way, so we're going to try to get him back on.
Yeah, because I'm looking forward to his answer about Bob Dole.
I know. Do you have a copy of the book with you?
I do not.
Oh. Okay. Aha. The plot thickens. Okay, his publicist is saying that he's working on getting back on. So just hopefully just a few more minutes and we'll have him back. Let me toggle you off, Mr. Dent, so you don't have to sit there. Okay, we're still waiting for Dan to get back on. Here we go. This might be him now. Hello.
Yes. Okay.
All right. We got you. Let me bring Mr. Dent back on.
Okay. All right. Okay, Charlie.
Okay, we're good.
I think we got it. Okay.
The challenges of the virtual world.
Yeah, anyway, sorry. I don't know where we were, but I apologize to the audience.
Oh, yeah. Dan, we were just talking about, you had mentioned Bob Dole. And I thought, being a Kansas Democrat, you had the privilege or the opportunity to work with former U.S. Senator Bob Dole and Nancy Landon Kassebaum as well. And, it's a largely Republican state, Kansas. And, you're being a Democrat, obviously you're in a minority. And how were those relationships, and how was it for you as a Democrat in Kansas working with these very, prestigious Republican senators and others?
Much better than it is now. We worked together on issues affecting Kansas, whether it's agriculture or aviation, certainly, or energy-related issues. Kassebaum and I were especially close. I was also very close to Dole. I thought about running against him on several occasions, but I knew that I couldn't win. He was an iconic man, a war hero, and majority leader of the United States Senate. So, it's a different world today. We would do a lot of things together, and I'm sure it still happens, Charlie. And you're more recent than I am, but it was, and also Senator Pat Roberts. The whole legislative team in Kansas worked together much more as a team than we do now.
Yeah, and was the delegation the same size back then as it is today?
Actually, when I first came in, it was 6 and 5, and now it's 4. So we haven't grown like the rest of the delegation. But when I first came in, we had 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. We had a Democratic governor. The state still has a Democratic governor, but it's much more Republican than it was before.
Yeah, it's obviously it's changed a great deal. And Senator Kassebaum, now, of course, she has quite a political lineage herself. I mean, I guess her father was Alf Landon, and ran for president back in the 30s.
He ran for president. He didn't do too well. He carried Maine and Vermont. It's the old story. As Maine goes, so goes Vermont. Kansas even went for FDR.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Yeah. I thought, I'd also just, talk a little bit more about your time at USDA, Department of Agriculture. Again, that must have been an exciting time, because here you are, you've been served with distinction in Congress for many years. Then, you during the Republican wave, you lose your election. I'm sure that must have been very difficult for you. And, for most people, oh my goodness, I'm down, I'm out. And then, somehow you turn that into a nice gig. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it's the old thing, when one door closes, another door opens, but you got to be standing right by that door, or else you won't get into the next room. And we had lost, the Democrats had lost the Congress, and Bill Clinton had to fill this slot because Mike Espy, who was the then Secretary of Agriculture, had left. And so I had friends in high places. One is Leon Panetta, the White House Chief of Staff. He and I came to Congress the same year. Al Gore, the Vice President of the United States. He and I came to Congress the same year. Then I had Bob Dole, the Senate Majority Leader, who I think had an ulterior motive. He might have wanted me to get out of Kansas forever, and he thought that this was a good place to park me, so to speak. But and Bill Clinton wanted somebody who could get confirmed right away. So he knew if Dole was supporting me and these other people thought I knew something about it, I could get the job right away. And I got it, and I got confirmed unanimously, which is something that was probably pretty rare these days.
Well, and everybody showed up, even more impressive.
Yeah,
yeah. That's fantastic. How was it? Look, I've had, I ran for office 13 times, and I would often say that I was 13-0, undefeated and unindicted, and I hope to keep it that way. Now, in your case, what was it like? I mean, experiencing after serving so long in the House, and then losing an election during a really tough year for Democrats. How did that feel? I mean, what was it like? I mean, emotionally and.
Well, first of all, it was a strange year, and there were issues like gun control, abortion, Bill Clinton's health care plan, and there was a wave. Every so often, there's a tidal wave, and right. I was part of it. And what happens is usually in those tidal waves, it's the moderates who get killed. The people on the extremes usually last, but the moderates got killed, and right. I was one of them. And I think I was depressed for about 3 days, but I went out to California to look for a job. Here's the irony, the next week. And I got off the plane, and my wife is calling me, the white paging phone, and she says, Dan, Leon Panetta wants to reach you right away. You got to call him. So I called him, and he said, would you like to be Secretary of Agriculture? Now, mind you, this is the next week. And so I said, well, and I had this anxiety attack, like, oh my God, I just lost the election. Now they're being Secretary of Agriculture. So I was going out for a job interview, and I was going to the Walt Disney Company to meet with an executive there about a job they had. And this guy had worked in government before, and I told him what had happened, and he says, well, if you get the chance, you ought to take the cabinet job, because you can always go to work in the private sector, but there are very few people who get to be cabinet secretaries. So that was kind of how it happened. There wasn't much time to get depressed about it. And by the way, when I was back in the Motion Picture Association, I used to go visit the president of Disney, Bob Iger, in that very same office that I was interviewed by the guy at Disney 10 or 15 years earlier.
Well, that's interesting. So immediately after Congress, you were already being pulled to Hollywood,
kind of indirectly. And of course, I have a son who's a film producer. My son was the president of MGM for 10 years, and now he has his own film production operation. So it's kind of in the family too, that part of it.
Yeah. And well, tell us about your time running the Motion Picture Association. In Congress, of course, you're trying to get the consensus, and you're dealing with some interesting personalities in the U.S. Congress, but you need allies. And now you go out to Hollywood, Motion Picture Association. Most of us think of Motion Picture Association. We think, oh yeah, they're the guys who rate the movies for us and tell us what's an R or PG or PG-13. And so tell us, like, what was that experience like, and what was it like dealing with these big time producers? Who I'm sure talk about a herd of cats. I mean,
yeah,
tough bunch.
My predecessor, Jack Valenta, used to say this job is nothing but herding cats. And look, it's a great industry. America is often known by its entertainment, movies, television, music, games, that kind of thing. But it was a tough business. And the average movie might cost $50 million to make and market, and you'd know in one day whether it was successful or not. And so I was sometimes at the brunt of the frustrations that these studio executives would feel when things didn't turn out so good. But one of the most interesting parts of the job is that the rating system. So people who go to movies, they see the movies rated G, PG, PG-13, R, whatever. And so I ran that part of the system, and I didn't see every movie because I had a team of people who were actually rating the movies. But the ratings had a lot to do with how successful a movie was, because if a movie was rated R as opposed to be rated PG-13, it could affect its revenues dramatically. And so there was a lot of pressure on me, but it was a lot of fun in that process too.
That's really interesting, because I was always kind of curious how the association was able to set down those ratings, and I didn't realize that the revenue implications were significant, or so significant. Can you tell us a little bit more about those interactions? I mean, you're dealing with, what kind of a board did you deal with out there, at the Motion Picture Association? I mean, you got, the big production companies, I suspect, all have a seat at the board. And I just to be a fly on the wall in one of those meetings, when you're dealing with these really powerful and influential people, and I'm sure, and they all have strong opinions.
It's very strong opinions. I would underline the very, but first of all, most of them were actually pretty easy to work with. And these were the big movie companies at the time, like Disney and Warner Brothers and Fox and Paramount. And the movie industry has changed a lot, though. Now it's become much more consolidated, streaming. You have new entries into the field. During the pandemic, we've seen how much the movie industry is moved to new content coming on television, and some really great content that's on there. But they have very strong personalities. But it was all a lot of fun too. I can't tell you that I cavorted with actors and actresses all that much, but I did go to the Academy Awards. My wife and I used to walk the red carpet, and I thought to myself, gee, this is really nice. A grandson of an immigrant from near Minsk is walking the red carpet now. And I sometimes would walk the red carpet, and people would say, the paparazzi would say, who is that man? And I thought to myself, oh, they didn't know this guy from agriculture very much.
Yeah, well, it's just it's quite a contrast going from going from wheat in Kansas to to the Motion Picture Association. And by the way, speaking of I'm back at agriculture again, and you're at USDA, and of course, just recently there's been a big there's been a big movement to try to reconcile or to make right some of the abuses against African American farmers. And this has been an issue that's been around for a long time. I was vaguely familiar with it during my time. I was aware that there were issues, again, where I live in Pennsylvania, there weren't a whole lot of African American farmers. So, but obviously in the South, there's a great tradition of agriculture among African Americans. And can you tell us a little bit about that? And was that an issue when you were there? And
it's interesting. It's interesting. When I was in Congress for 18 years and on the Agriculture Committee, I don't recall ever having one hearing on this issue of treatment of African American farmers and discrimination by the U.S. government, the Department of Agriculture. And of course, I don't recall in my time there was ever an African American member of Congress on the committee. There was one before me, Shirley Chisholm, who was on that committee. But when I got to the Department of Agriculture, I had to face all sorts of claims against discrimination, and they were real. These claims that had occurred over years and decades, so we settled some of these cases. President Clinton basically said, "Let's get these things settled. We do not want this on our watch," and we partially settled the cases, and now they are in the process of being further settled by Tom Vilsack, the current Secretary of Agriculture. I noticed that there is a judge in Florida has put a hold on one of the legislative pieces that Congress has passed, and I hope that hold gets lifted. But it was certainly a key part of my time at USDA to try to get rid of the historic vestiges of discrimination.
Yeah, what do you think was your greatest success at the time at USDA? Again, a lot of people I don't think know what you do. I mean, you work with both the producers of our food, those are the growers, and you also deal with the folks who are on the receiving end, who need food assistance and nutrition programs. What do you think was the greatest success that you had at that time?
There's not one success. The African American farmers was one, but we dealt with food stamps because the SNAP program is part of USDA, school lunch. We also dealt with overseas trade. The biggest part of the Department of Agriculture, believe it or not, is the U.S. Forest Service, has 40,000 out of the 100,000 employees. I come from Kansas. We don't have a lot of trees in Kansas, so it wasn't one of my specialties. But I learned my best to deal with that. So this was an agency that really, nutrition programs, I can't even go through all of the different aspects and the variety of programs that USDA dealt with.
Yeah, and speaking of that, speaking of agriculture and speaking of table manners, you once said, you wrote, that use napkins to wipe your mouth, not for state secrets. What does that mean?
Okay, so this is an incident that happened when I was in Congress, and we had an Air Force base around Wichita that had Titan missiles. These were these liquid-fueled missiles that had nuclear warheads on top of them. They no longer have those because they're not very safe to operate. So we had an explosion at one. And so I went and talked to the base commander. He met me at the Wichita airport to explain to me what happened. And he drew a picture of the missile and the missile silos and where things were located on a napkin. And so just explained to me what was going on. And so I said, thank you. And I went to my plane. And then a few minutes later, he rushed back into the airport and he found me and I said, what's the problem? He said, where's the napkin? And I said, what napkin? He said, the napkin I drew the picture of the missile on. And I said, I don't know. I assume they threw it away or somebody wiped their mouth on it. And I don't think that the Russians ever got a hold of that napkin. I think it was ultimately thrown away.
Yeah, it probably just went to the local landfill. But oh my goodness. Yeah, well, I often found in my experience those classified briefings that we always were subjected to as members of Congress. We're not quite as interesting as we were, told or most people think. I always felt that I already read everything in the newspaper before I ever showed up to those meetings. I didn't always feel like I was learning a whole lot new.
The problem is you couldn't confirm it. You would know it, but
Exactly.
You couldn't say that it was true or not.
Exactly. It seems like all open source. Well, I have just a couple other little questions. What really was the motivation for you to write this book? I mean, you've lived a very eventful life, obviously. From Kansas to Congress to Harvard. You were at the Institute of Politics up there. Of course, you were at Aspen, where I am now. Agriculture, motion picture. I mean, you've done a lot of things. not a boring life by any
No,
means.
no. I haven't been able to keep a job all that long, but I'd say what motivated me more than anything else is I had this kind of diverse life. But one of the things that struck me is that self-deprecating humor was a big part of my life and my family's life, and it was a way I was able to kind of get through the ups and downs of life. And we've kind of developed into a humorless society politically. I mean, it's like the atmosphere is toxic, and in part because nobody has any fun any longer. Politics was fun when I served, particularly in the early years. And members came to Washington, their families came to Washington. The job is in Washington. The job isn't in the home district. I mean, you'd go home to try to take care of your constituents, but the Constitution empowers Congress to make laws, and laws are made in Washington, so we could socialize there. And I just thought that maybe my experience in bringing a little bit of this self-deprecating humor as a way that I was able to be somewhat successful is something that we could use more of. And if you look back at most of our great presidents, or at least our impactful presidents, Lincoln, FDR, Reagan, Kennedy, these are all people that had great senses of humor, and they could lead with that. And that's another point I was trying to make.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, it is important. You're right, because I do feel like we do live in a humorless society at times. And, you hear about comedians right now who don't go to college campuses anymore because their remarks are not always very welcomed.
Well, one thing, Charlie, is that I think people are a little bit nervous and insecure about being funny because it'll be on YouTube 5 years from now. And I of course, I don't argue for a politically incorrect or mean or bullying humor, but sometimes I think naturalness is what we need, more genuine nature of that kind of humor.
Well, actually, I just said to a young woman the other day who told me she was getting ready to go on her honeymoon. I said, well, yeah, better to have loved and lost than to have married and kept on losing. And I said,
you're in deep trouble, Charlie, is all I can say.
My wife has heard me say this a few times, and she's not in the vicinity. So,
yeah.
So I can get away with it today. But you're right. That was always part of the fun with Congress, to be able to joke with some of the members. I remember once going on the back of the House floor, and I know what your experience was in the House floor, Dan, but mine was, I often equated the House floor to the prison yard. That when they were all there voting, I knew where people hung out in groups or gangs, and I said, "There's the prison yard." And there was a group of older Republican members who were all standing back there, and I used to refer to them as the Viagra caucus. So what's going on back there today, gentlemen? I'd like to get in on these conversations, and you could have some fun, and that was some of the best part of the job. And with this pandemic, of course, as we're all dealing with, I feel badly for these newer members who've come in and they were just marching onto the floor to vote, and they marched right off. They couldn't congregate because of the social distancing requirements. It really takes a lot of the fun out of the job, not being able to interact.
Yeah, I remember the Pennsylvania guys used to stand in the back and
corner.
And mostly Democrats, but there would be bipartisan delegations, groups even within that. I mean, you led by people like Congressman Murtha and others that they were real institutionalists. And look, I'm not overly nostalgic. We had our issues, and when I was in Congress, we had our fights and battles. But I remember when I was a freshman congressman, Hubert Humphrey, the former vice president, was a senator and he was invited to speak to a session of the House. First time a U.S. senator had ever been invited to address the House, and he was dying at that time. And I remember he said, "Fight every battle like it's the most important battle of your life, but after it's over, your opponent is not your enemy. He or she was your opponent. Go up to him, or her, shake their hand, because you're going to need them desperately on the next battle that you fight." And that was the mantra that I think you believed in so much.
Oh, absolutely. There were members with whom I always learned early on, when you're going to disagree with somebody disagree with them on the policy issue, don't make it personal. Because I can't tell you how many times I'd be in a debate or an argument with one of my colleagues today, but tomorrow I knew I was going to be working with them on another issue where we were close allies. So we never try to, especially if I was winning, not to rub it in, just to, you're going to win today, be gracious, and don't gloat. But you mentioned Jack Murtha. You're right. He always sat back in that, what they called the Pennsylvania corner. And speaking of of humor. I just thought I'd share this with you, Dan. I don't know if I ever told you this. When I was first appointed to the House Ethics Committee, Jack Murtha sent two emissaries, two Pennsylvania Democrats, over to see me on the House floor. And they said to me, Murtha wanted us to tell you something. I said, what's that? And then why isn't he telling me himself? They said, well, Murtha wanted us to tell you that we don't want anybody on the ethics committee who wants to be on the ethics committee. And I said, well, you can tell Jack I didn't volunteer. I was conscripted. So he can rest easily. So that was the kind of stuff that would happen on the floor that I thought was kind of,
he was also kind of the pay raise guy to go. Because, you could never get a pay raise in Congress. And so he was the one that would always be the architect of a pay raise. And I had heard this rumor there was a pay raise located in a coal miner black lung bill that periodically would happen. And so I went up to him and I said, I hear there's a pay raise in this bill. And he looked at me like with daggers coming out of his eyes, because I said, I won't say a word to anybody. Just do me a favor. Wink at me if there is a pay raise in this bill. So he winked at me and he says, but I'll kill you if I hear you say anything about it. And so I remember I voted against this bill, and nobody could understand how I could vote against the coal miners bill. But it saved me some grief and aggravation, certainly.
Well, if you were from southwestern Pennsylvania like Murtha was, black lung disease was a big deal. So,
right.
You could put anything else in there, and he's always going to be safe voting for it. No, Dan, just one other thing too. I thought I just mention. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what your thoughts are on the way campaigns are run and PACs and how it's changed. I mean, even since I left in 2018, and it just seems like so much has changed in terms of the media environment, the fundraising, how members are able to monetize their notoriety now, which you really couldn't do. If you got in real trouble back then, you basically kept your mouth shut and hoped that they didn't force you out through a resignation. And now, you can take that notoriety and raise money off of it and not hang your head in shame like was the case for most of us, when we served.
Remember the guy who told Obama, you lie, right in the middle of the State of the Union speech, and he raised $1 million the next day?
Yeah, Joe Wilson, yeah.
Yeah, but to give you some idea, Charlie, when I ran for Congress in 76, I spent a total of $100,000 on my race, primary and general, and defeated an incumbent Republican who also only spent $100,000 on his race. This is 1976. I could buy a 30-second spot on Wichita TV for $100. And today, you got to spend $100,000 a day and raise that kind of money. So that has probably changed the institution more than about anything else,
Yeah, I'll tell you, back when I was in too, if I wanted to put ads up on Philadelphia television, that was $400,000 or $500,000 a week. I mean, that's how expensive it was. And I imagine that the numbers are only greater now than they were then. Tell us too, you get back to this thing about being assaulted as a cabinet member, and I think about it now too, as we come out of January 6th. And many members of Congress are under real threat these days, more than they've ever been. And again, they're not going to talk about it very publicly, but I know many of them are spending more of their members' reimbursable allowance, the money they use to run their offices, for security. The people are just, it just seems there are more threats. We've always had threats. We've always had issues where somebody makes a threat against a member. But it seems now it's just so much more common, and that the threats seem to be more credible.
Yeah, the threats that I got when I was secretary were really few and far between, and they were targeted on, let's say, people who had very extreme views on food. Like today, the threats that members of Congress face are based upon their views, their ideology. And a lot of those threats come from extremists on the edges of society. And it's really a shame. I always felt, and I know you feel the same thing, that most public policy is made, to use the football analogy, between the 40-yard line and the 40-yard line, not between the end zone and the 20-yard line. And so, if you don't appeal to those people in the end zone, a lot of them can become pretty nasty.
Well, yeah, and see, that was where we have a lot of commonality, Dan, because you were a Democrat in Kansas. I was a Republican in a fairly Democratic area of Pennsylvania, and we always learned that our path to success in politics was not simply to pander to a base, because it simply wasn't large enough,
No.
to win. So you had to find ways to win independents, and in your case, persuadable Republicans, and I had to win persuadable Democrats, significant numbers of which. And so you had to find ways to find commonality, not just simply throw red meat out to a base that couldn't elect you by itself. And
well, that's why some form of redistricting reform is so important, because most congressional districts are now geared towards strong blue or strong red, rather than having a better mix of people where you have to appeal to folks of different ideologies.
Yeah, and that is a very harsh reality, and it's something I've noticed too, that it tended to be that the leaders in the House anyway, and I think largely in the Senate too, the leaders in the House tended, on both sides, tended to represent very safe districts. And so when we talk about these types of political calculations that, like you said earlier, the moderates, during wave years are the ones who get swept out.
Right.
They get swept out, not because they did anything wrong, but because they're just in a more vulnerable political situation. And they just, it just doesn't work out. It won't work for them. And I think most of the leaders, in many cases, just don't understand those pressures, and their natural inclination is to just tack to the base, more now than back then. But that's where we are today, it seems.
Well, there was this former agriculture commissioner of Texas, Jim Hightower. He was a big buddy of Willie Nelson. And he once said, the only good thing in the middle of the road is a yellow stripe and a dead armadillo. And I used to say, yeah, and then people like me, and you get hit from both sides. That's the problem.
Yeah, I hear you. In fact, and I saw, speaking of getting hit from both sides, John Boehner's out there too. He's also selling a book too. And I remember how he would how be so frustrated, trying just to manage this, that, you have responsibilities to govern, and then you have a base that in many cases was, demanding that you not govern. And you have responsibilities as a leader and as an institution, and managing that is very difficult, and it forces people out, and it's driving them crazy. It's driving us all crazy.
Yeah, no question about it.
Yeah. So in these concluding minutes, I thought I'd just kind of go back to something we talked about earlier, C-SPAN. You were involved, and you, Mr. Lamb, with whom you worked, established it. What role did you actually play at the time in helping getting those C-SPAN cameras placed on the House floor? You were involved with that. I know you.
Well, Brian Lamb and others thought about this idea, working with the cable industry to get Congress covered. But it was interesting. They could broadcast it out into the country. So like my mother could see it, but you couldn't see it from your offices, or you couldn't see it in the internal network. And so I was somewhat responsible for getting it shown so people could actually see it as they were working from their offices. Whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know, but I think transparency is still good in politics.
Well, yeah, that's right. You can take credit or blame depending on the circumstances. Because now we've and because of you, Dan Glickman, we got to see members of Congress speak to empty chambers on
That's right.
television.
That's right.
And a lot more grandstanding during what we would call those special orders late in the evening, when members could go to give those speeches at night, and they'd be televised, and I guess 5 million people would be watching it every night, and generating some interest. So but that was actually very important in many respects, even though we joke about it, that it's made some people more long-winded and apt to show up late at night just to give a speech to an empty chamber. But I think it's done a lot to at least show people how the proceedings of the House actually work, and that is a good thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, any other accomplishments too that you wanted to share with us about your time, either at the MPAA or even at Harvard? You ran the Institute of Politics up there, and that's a very prestigious position, actually. And
well, it's funny. when I was graduated from high school, I applied to Harvard, and my application got rejected before it was even received. So when I got this job at the Institute of Politics, I thought to myself, I'm going to get into Harvard come hell or high water. And yeah, it was also a great job because I was able to deal with young people, graduate and undergraduate students at the Kennedy School. Met a lot of people there. A lot of them who had come from Congress and the executive branch and the administration, and people who are trying their best to make government work better. You know, I go back to this point that Bob Dole told me, and it's a little bit of an issue that affecting, perhaps in conclusion, we can talk just briefly about this, is why go into public service unless your goal is not, unless your goal really is not to make government work better. Dole used to say, why be in this job if you're not getting things done? And he also used to say you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a simple reason. And you're supposed to listen twice as much as you talk. And I've used that as kind of a way of a mantra and I tell people that, young people, that nothing wrong with listening. You don't have to be talking all the time. Sometimes you'll learn more from somebody else than listening to yourself. And but the goal in our political system is to get things done. And let's hope that the next few years reverses the trends of the past few years in that regard.
Yeah, I'll tell you, you're right, because there were some sages like that who, who had to remind a lot of us, that we had responsibilities. I remember Roy Blunt, the senator from Missouri, when he was in the House, he was the House Republican whip, and he said to me once, I'll never forget this. He said, never say what you will never do, because you may end up doing it someday. And the other thing he told me that, I forgot what it was. Ron Paul at the time, the congressman from Texas, Rand's father, he would vote no on every bill, virtually every bill. And you just couldn't understand it. I remember Roy saying to me one day, if you had 40 or 50 people in the majority voting no on all these bills, you can have a real problem around here. Well, sure enough, we had a few of those, a lot more of them, made life very, very difficult. And it was a difficult thing, because I remember he said once to me that, you have to pass a debt ceiling. If you can't vote for that, you might want to, think about getting in another line of business, because you're going to have to deal with it. But that's one thing that has changed. And that's why these roles that you've taken on, whether it's at the Aspen Institute, where you served before me, running the congressional program at Harvard, you're basically in the business of trying to get people to at least collaborate, cooperate, talk to each other, and hopefully govern better. And that's a real testament to you and to your career, as a congressman. And we're sorely lacking all of that in today's.
Well, I'm following. We're following in each other's footsteps, Charlie, because you're the same kind of guy, and so let's just hope we can elect more people to Congress who can be of different political philosophies, but have the same tone, the same constructive way of trying to approach each other.
Yeah, that was always the thing I like to point out, that I can deal with people who are very, very conservative or very, very progressive or liberal. I can deal with them as long as they have a pragmatic sense about them, as long as they understand what's achievable and what's not. I always would point out Tom Cole and Rosa DeLauro, 2 Congress men and women from different philosophically, but every year they manage to pass a very important bill on human service, education, medical research funding.
Right.
And they do it every single year, and they know what how far the other can go, and they're respectful to one another. And even though they couldn't be more misaligned or disaligned philosophically, they put their names together on a bill every year and they get it done. And we're losing that, it seems.
And most major things that we do as American society and politics have to be done across the aisle. I mean, when one party, of course, we have the problem today because the margins are so close in the House and the Senate, and it's hard to do that. But nothing major, nothing transformational gets done with one party doing it alone. Right. Period.
Yeah, and absolutely right. And by the way, and to conclude, I know when you served obviously at the USDA and of course on the Agriculture Committee in the House, I always felt that committee too was one where people, they were there because they cared about agriculture, and they on both sides, and they tried to find areas of agreement wherever they could on a farm bill. Well, that's getting harder to do now, but they always tried.
Right.
Yeah, and so we thank you, Dan.
All right. Well, Charlie, always a pleasure to be your friend, and thanks to our friends in Florida for doing such a great job. I'm a big fan of independent book sellers. I hope
Thank
you are
you.
very successful.
Thank you so much.
I have to mention how sorry I am as what's happened just north of you,
Yeah.
and we hope
Thank you.
that never happens again either.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I just wanted to say, Mr. Dent, you're the perfect moderator for this event because you have such a great sense of humor. Such a great sense of humor. And it was a joy to listen to both of you.
Well,
and I just want to thank you both for joining us and remind everyone watching, if you don't already have a copy of this book, you can get it by just pressing the green button. We'll ship it off to you. If you're in Miami, you want to stop by one of our stores, we have it there too. And just thank you on behalf of Books and Books and Miami Book Fair, and hopefully we will see you in person sometime soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Heartfelt prayers to everybody in Florida.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. Bye.
Bye. Thanks,
Bye,
Charlie.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Dan.